A work session was held in Augusta today regarding a bill that would protect transgender patients and Maine providers traveling to the state for medical care. LD 227 would also protect patients and health care providers in Maine who perform abortions or provide in vitro fertilization, which is illegal in other states. Just last week, attorneys general from 15 other states sent a letter to Governor Janet Mills, Attorney General Aaron Frey, the Senate President, and Maine's House Speaker threatening to sue the state if the bill passes. More concerns were voiced as the bill was discussed.
Provisions of this amendment don't affect or amend the criminal statutes in Maine and would not affect the discretion of prosecutors or investigators to investigate potential crimes in Maine.
That's not the way I read it, though. I read it that you could not investigate a crime, even in kidnapping, even. And so I'm saying, how do you know what they were brought across the lines for? And how do you determine that as a law enforcement officer? And then if you get investigating, you could be sued as a law enforcement officer, and the parents can be sued.
According to the Prosecutors Association, it was stated that there's nothing in the statute that affects the underlying authority in state law to investigate any crime. So if law enforcement felt an issue needed to be investigated, there's nothing in the statute to stop that process. The Senior Vice President of Program Services from Maine Family Planning released a statement saying, quote, "Gender-affirming care is under attack in other states, putting providers at risk for vigilantism from licensing boards that would use interstate compacts to penalize clinicians or from insurers that would use them to reject coverage," unquote. The bill passed the committee and will head to the legislature.